Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the new Anbernic RG Rotate. So this little guy kind of looks like a Game Boy Advance SP in terms of size and shape, but it's got a screen on the front that rotates up to reveal some controls, and then also it's just a full-fledged Android device. And among all these standard handheld shapes and sizes we've seen over the years, this one feels a bit like a breath of fresh air, just because it's kind of unique and this rotating thing is really fun. I've only had this device for a couple days, so this is more of an impressions video than a full-on review, but I have been putting it through its paces and I've really enjoyed it. And so in this video, we will mostly focus on things like controls and the screen and the audio experience, and also what it's like to play games on it and also do things that aren't games on it too. This is probably going to be pretty in-depth, so grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by talking about the specs and the pricing. The CPU here is the Unisoc T618. This chip has been used in several handhelds over the years, including quite a few from Anbernic themselves. It's pretty powerful, it's able to play up through Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP no problem, and it can play a fair bit of GameCube and PS2 if you really want to push it. It's also got 3 GB of RAM and only 32 GB of internal storage, but it does have a microSD card slot so you can expand that as well. The display is unique. I have not seen this on any other handheld before. It's 3.5 inches with a resolution of 720 by 720, making it a perfect square. We have seen other devices with square displays, but it's usually a standard 4-inch display, so this one's a little bit smaller. Another thing that's smaller is the battery on this. It's only 2,000 milliamp hours. I thought that was a typo the first time I saw it. Most devices with this chipset usually have a 4,000 milliamp hour battery or larger, so I did a little bit of preliminary testing. Here are the results, and on the top right, I want to make note of the fact that it had 6% battery standby drain overnight. This means that last night I put it to sleep, and when I woke up this morning about 8 hours later, it had lost 6% of battery. Now, it is probably the same amount of drain that you would get with other devices, but because the battery is so small, that's why it's a full 6% instead of your typical 2 or 3%. So this leads me to think that this is a device I would likely turn off when I'm not using it as opposed to putting it to sleep, just because the drain is quite high. Let's take a look at the 3 scenarios I did for testing. On the far right, we have PlexAmp. This is an audio streaming app, and I played this with the screen turned off, so using it like an MP3 player with a headphone jack connected to a USB adapter. And with a setup like this, I got a little bit over 8 hours of playback time. I don't think that's half bad. In the middle, I was going for a very basic gaming scenario, something kind of low profile, a Game Boy game running RetroArch with a LCD 3X shader. For this one, I also tested it with headphones plugged in with a USB adapter, and I got a little bit over 5.5 hours of battery. And then on the far left, I did an hour of just mixed gaming, mostly focusing on high-end stuff like Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, Dreamcast, but then also some retro games as well. And after 1 hour of gameplay, it drained exactly 20%. So projecting from there, I would guess it to be about 5 hours of mixed gameplay, which is exactly what Anbernic said in their spec sheet as well, that it would have 5 hours of battery life. And so overall, I think it's actually better battery life than I was expecting with a 2,000 milliamp hour battery. But in general, I would say that, yeah, you're going to get around 5 hours of gaming depending on what you're playing. It's also worth noting I was able to charge this device with just about anything. So fast chargers, slow chargers, USB-C cables, USB-A cables, all that worked great. The fastest I saw it charge was 9 watts, which is actually pretty good with a 2,000 milliamp hour battery. I'm able to charge this thing in about an hour or a little bit less. So in other words, when it comes to charging and the battery, I wasn't as disappointed with this whole setup as I thought I was going to be. Moving on to weight, it really depends on the color that you're getting. If you get the black model, which comes in plastic, it's going to be 168 grams, and then there's an all-metal construction as well in silver, and that one is 206 grams. So either way you look at it, it's going to be somewhere between 6 or 7.5 ounces altogether. In terms of connectivity, this has 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0, but it is worth noting that this chip is not capable of video out via USB. It's running Android 12 as its operating system, and it does have a couple other standard things you would expect to see in a handheld, including a rumble motor as well as gyroscopic controls. Now the device is not out yet, but I did get all of the details, so it's launching on May 11th at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. The retail price of the plastic model is going to be $88 plus shipping, and then retail for the metal one will be $108. And like with all of Anbernic's launches, in the first 72 hours they will have a slight discount, so it's going to be $5 cheaper there, so 83 versus 103 between these two. And price-wise, this isn't half bad. I was expecting it to be a lot higher because of all the RAM shortages, but yeah, this is actually one of the cheapest T618 chipset devices I've seen at launch. It's also unique in that this is the first time I've seen them launch both a plastic and a metal device at the exact same time. They've staggered out other ones before, but I like the fact that we have the choice right from the get-go. Let's take a look inside the box, and of note, this was sent over by Anbernic for review. They sent me both the plastic and metal units, but like with all my videos, all opinions are going to be my own. They have not seen this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. The box itself is pretty unique because it has a metallic finish to it, but otherwise it's just a very simple setup as usual. And the two color options are called both Polar Black as well as Aurora Silver. Inside the box, you're going to get the device itself, but then also an additional box with a bunch of stuff inside. In here, we've got a USB-C to USB-A charging cable, a lanyard in case you want to add that to your device, and then also a screen protector. There's also a user manual that's got just, your typical hotkey stuff, and then also 2 additional shoulder buttons. By default, your L2 and R2 buttons are going to be completely flush with the rest of the device, which makes it really nice and pocketable just because there's nothing sticking out in any way. If you want to swap the buttons out, it's pretty easy, but you will have to take the device apart. It's going to require 1.5 hex screws, just 4 of them here on the back, and then it'll come right out. The shoulder and trigger buttons themselves are actually connected together with a piece of foam tape, so you'll have to remove the L2 or R2 button directly from here. It might feel like you're kind of breaking the device because you're taking the tape off of it, but you're just going to use that to stick the other one on. So it's not very hard to make this modification, but it does require you to open up the device, but everything else just slots right into place, so not that big of a deal. All told, it took me about a minute, maybe 2 minutes altogether to go through and figure out how it works and then put them together. Of note, while we have it open, you can see that the heat shield at the top is actually where the CPU is, so the battery is not on top of the CPU like it has been on other Anbernic products. Overall, I think that's a good thing. There are many concerns about pushing too much heat into the battery and degrading it over time, so that's not going to be a concern here. So here's a look at the elevated trigger buttons versus the flush ones. And I think that from a play standpoint, yes, the elevated ones are a lot easier to use just because your fingers are going to be able to find them easily. But I also like the fact that this is just completely flush. For most of the games that you'll be playing here, you're probably not going to be using the L2 and R2 outside of hotkeys. And so it really depends on how often you plan on pushing it and whether or not you want to be able to differentiate it a little bit easier. And so what I'll do for my final review of this device in my long-term testing, I'll just kind of figure out whether or not I prefer one over the other over the course of the next week or so. Another thing I did on this metal unit is I added the screen protector, and I didn't on the plastic one. So this is another thing that I can test over the course of the next week before I do my final review. So let's talk about first impressions right out the gate. And number one is that this is a little bit smaller than I was expecting. After seeing the promo videos from Anbernic, I thought this thing was going to be really chunky, but no, it's basically the same as a Game Boy Advance SP. In fact, it's actually a little bit smaller than the original Game Boy Advance SP and not quite as thick either. And yeah, I think it's perfectly pocketable. Here it is compared to the other Anbernic clamshells like the 3.5XX SP, the 3.4XX SP, and yeah, it's quite a bit smaller, not as thick and then also not as tall or wide. At the end of the day, it is a pocketable handheld, but it is a little bit thicker than I personally would have liked. I would love to have seen something even smaller, but I'm still not as concerned about the size as I was when I first heard about it. My next impression was just the overall rotating aspect of it. And man, it is super satisfying. Like, it feels really good. I know a lot of people were worried it was going to be flimsy or something, but man, it feels great. The rotating hinge mechanism is actually metal. So it's got a metal plate on the back right here, and it feels very sturdy, especially on the metal version. The plastic version also has a metal plate on the back, so it feels very satisfying too. Not quite as sturdy as the all-metal one, but still very good. To me, it feels like something that I could flip all day and not worry about it degrading over time, mostly because of the metal construction. A lot of people were asking whether or not you can flip it with a single hand, and you can, but you got to use your right hand for it. That's the most natural way of doing it. Left-handed, it just doesn't really feel very natural. We'll talk about software later, but there are several things that you can have it do when you open and close it, like just not doing anything or showing a clock or putting it to sleep like I have here. And between the two, I think the metal one is definitely more premium and sturdy feeling, and it really isn't that much heavier than the plastic one. And so if you're looking for something that's metal and kind of unique, this is really neat. For me personally, I like my retro systems to feel a little bit retro, so I do prefer plastic devices in general, and so the plastic one is the one that I've been testing over the past couple of days. In the end, I like both of them, and I think that people are probably going to have a lot of online arguments about which one is best, but personally, I think they're both good, and I can see the value in getting the metal one if you want something a bit sturdier and a little bit more premium. The only other difference between the two is that the metal one has this acrylic plate and then the Anbernic logo underneath, whereas the plastic one doesn't have it. Looking around the rest of the device, we've got our volume up and down buttons, a micro SD card slot, and then of course our shoulder and trigger buttons like we already mentioned. Up top, we've got our USB-C port for charging, as well as a little LED, which will turn red when it's charging and then green when it's done. There's also this little stopper right here, so when you open it up, you can see it sticking out from the metal plate, and so that will close down right here. On the right side, we've got a power button and then also the Anbernic button, so if you press and hold this, it will open up the Anbernic front end or the front end of your choice. On the back, we've got an Anbernic logo and then our single speaker, which is backfiring. We'll talk about this when we get into the audio. Speaking of audio, this thing does not have a 3.5mm headphone jack. You'll have to use a USB adapter. I think it's one of the strangest omissions that Anbernic has ever done, because this thing kind of functions as a multi-purpose media device and there's no headphone jack. Now let's talk about the controls, and it's largely going to be the same between the two. The buttons and everything else are identical, other than the fact that one's plastic and one is a metal shell. And the first thing to note is that the buttons and the D-pad are clicky. Kind of like the Game Boy Advance SP or the SP devices from Anbernic, they have some sort of dome or micro switch connection underneath. They're not rubber membrane. This means that they have shallow travel to them and they take a little bit more force than a rubber membrane, but it's not too bad. In fact, it's probably the best that I've seen from Anbernic when it comes to clicky controls. The sound between the two is distinct. The metal one's got a little bit of a higher pitch click to it, whereas the plastic one's a little bit more thunky and classic sounding. Let me give you a quick listen between the two and then also compared to some other models. So overall, I would say that the metal one's a little bit louder than the plastic one, but not by much, and they're both quieter than the other SP models that Anbernic has released. They are louder than the standard GBA SP, but I think they're actually relatively quiet. Let's talk about the D-pad next, and one of my favorite things about it is that it's a bit wider and chunkier compared to other models like the RG34XX SP, so I like the fact that it's a little bit fatter all around. Because it uses switches, it doesn't really have any pivot at all. Instead, you can just feel each of these very precise inputs. When it comes to the contra test where I press down and then rock it left and right, it really doesn't do anything unless I push it really far to one side or the other. And when I do that, I get an audible click as I'm pressing down on either left or right. And so this D-pad is not at risk of getting any accidental diagonals. It's pretty straightforward. Now for fighting games, it's a little bit harder because there is no real pivot to this D-pad, so you have to be very deliberate in your Hadoukens and Shoryukens. I've never been good with this type of D-pad with this style game, but I can pull off the moves. My advice would be to try to move it along the edge of the D-pad as opposed to centered. Even then, I'm still missing inputs left and right, and so I would not really consider this to be ideal for fighting games, but I bet with a bit of practice, you will make it work. The face buttons are great, they're clicky but light to the touch, and so I like the overall feeling of playing with these as well. Also in the front, we've got our select and start buttons. These are clicky micro switches, and then also our back and home button right here. The shoulder and trigger buttons are clicky micro switches. They're a little bit louder than the face buttons, but still not super loud altogether. Now obviously this device does not have analog sticks, and that could present a problem depending on what you're trying to play, especially because this CPU has enough power to be able to play things like Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast, which heavily relied on analog input. And thankfully there's a very quick fix for that, in that you can just press the volume up and power buttons quickly and it'll enable a virtual joystick, and so this D-pad will now have analog input. It obviously is still going to be a 4-way input, so you don't have all the nuance of an actual analog stick, but it'll work in the software like this too, so you can control a Nintendo 64 game or something else like that with the D-pad, even if it wasn't set up to. To switch back, you just press the buttons again, and it'll say that it'll disable the virtual joystick, and so it's back to the D-pad. So that'll be handy depending on the games you're trying to play. If you're trying to play with the 2 analog sticks set up, then obviously that's not going to work out, and that's one of the reasons why I don't think this is going to be a good fit for things like GameCube and PS2, which often relied on that right analog stick. Now, another question that people had was whether or not the ergonomics felt good, and I think honestly they kind of nailed it. Like, even with the plastic model, I was worried that this metal part up top would make it top heavy feeling, but no, it's perfectly balanced. And so I found this to be very comfortable to hold and play, both with the plastic and the metal model. In terms of balancing it into my hands, it kind of feels like a vertical handheld when you have the screen up. So something like the Anbernic RG 35XX Plus, it kind of feels the same overall in terms of width and overall height. One concern I had was how low these buttons are when you're holding it, but honestly, after playing it for a couple days, it's not something I've really noticed. I haven't gotten any hand cramps or anything else like that during my testing. Like with most vertical handhelds, it doesn't really have a ton of space on the back, so you're going to have to like interweave your fingers or do something else. But in general, I still think it's about the same as any other device at this size. So at the end of the day, I think it's comfortable enough to hold, but the great thing about it is that it can get quite small once you close it up. And that's probably the biggest draw of this thing altogether, in that it's small and pocketable, but then also it can get bigger and more comfortable once you open it up. Now, when comparing it to a full-on clamshell, I think the clamshell is more comfortable because it's just larger overall in terms of the space that you can hold it, plus the space up above. And so I think that this is probably more comfortable to hold and play over a long period of time. But still, I love the fact that this thing gets so small too. It's a little bit smaller than that clamshell as well. It's not a big difference, but it's enough that I feel like the RG Rotate is something that I would rather throw in my pocket than one of these clamshells. Okay, let's talk about the screen, and I think it's actually a pretty darn good screen in most respects. And number one is the fact that this thing gets super bright. It's bright enough that I think you can probably play it outdoors in just about any scenario. So in direct sunlight or in the shade, all of this is still visible for me. Among these smaller Anbernic devices, this one might be the brightest screen that I've seen from them, and that's a good thing. And because it's a square aspect ratio, I think a lot of people are going to assume that it's going to excel with things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, you know, those systems that had a square aspect ratio, but you can do quite a bit more with it. Here's a look at how it scales with most of the more popular systems. And yes, some of those more square aspect ratios are going to look pretty awesome. But another thing to bear in mind about this screen is that it's not very large. It's 3.5 inches square. That means that when you start to play things that are in a 4:3 or even wider aspect ratio, it is going to get quite small. Your standard 4:3 systems are going to be about 3.1 inches, Game Boy Advance will be about 3, and then something that's 16:9 like PSP is going to be tiny. It's 2.8 inches. And for me, 2.8 inches when playing PSP is just too small. We'll talk about it more when we get to actual game testing. It's also worth noting the only system that actually integer scales is Game Boy Advance at a 3x scale. And that one does look great, and there are a couple other tricks that we can do. One of my favorites is with Super Nintendo, Nintendo, and TurboGrafx-16. Each of these look very good at an 8:7 aspect ratio, which is going to fill out more of the display. On top of that, these are a 2.8x scale, and so what you can do here is you can turn on overscale, which is going to blow it up a little bit. It's going to cut off a couple pixels on the left and right, but those are usually not going to be used by the game anyway. The end result here is that you can get integer scaling with Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and TurboGrafx-16, and it looks awesome to me. And so this is one of the things I used to do on other square screens with this same resolution, and it works perfectly here too. And so this definitely has been one of my favorite ways to play some of those old school console systems. I think Super Nintendo looks awesome on here in particular. Now, one of the major issues with the T618 devices from Anbernic is that the screen itself usually is over-sharpened. They assured me that they fixed it with this device, and looking at it in some context, it does look a lot better. For example, just here directly on the screen, it doesn't look over-sharpened to me, and same thing with a white background. In fact, this looks nicely balanced. And so to the naked eye, I thought that yeah, they had fixed it, no problem here whatsoever, but once I busted out my macro lens at a 10x zoom like this, I did see something funky when I went into white text with a black background. And here, if we look at the word automatically, you can see there's a bit of a halo effect around the text, and this is exactly what the over-sharpening can do. Now, this is a lot less less than I've seen it with previous devices, and because the screen is so small, it's probably something you may not detect. In fact, I did not see it until I used the macro lens. So I think they have fixed the over-sharpening for the most part, but it's not completely gone, as you can see. As a comparison, here is the Anbernic RG 477V, and this one is in the exact same menu, and you can see there's no halo effect around this text. So it's a little bit over-sharpened, but I would say it's still acceptable on the RG Rotate. And because it's a known chipset, I would expect that Gamma OS, which is a third-party Android software, will be coming for this device as well, and that usually will fix the over-sharpening effect too. So putting it all together, I think this is a good screen. It's a little bit small, so definitely don't get this if you have poor eyesight, but for being a 3.5-inch display with a square aspect ratio and a 720 resolution, we've got a lot of options when it comes to scaling, and certain systems look awesome on this. And even though there may be some over-sharpening happening here, I really haven't noticed it when in actual gameplay. I had to bust out a macro lens to even notice it. Okay, now let's talk about audio. This is probably one of the worst experiences with the RG Rotate in many different ways. The first is that we've got a backfiring speaker. The tech specs in their marketing materials actually says stereo speakers, but I took everything apart and confirmed that yes, it's just one single mono speaker. It's quite big, but yeah, it's just one. And having a backfiring speaker like this does make it for a pretty poor overall listening experience without using headphones. The audio that comes out of the speaker is not half bad, but when it's facing away from you, it's much more muffled, to the point where it just doesn't feel very good. Let me give you a listen here, and I'm going to rotate the device back and forth so you can hear what it's going to sound like for other people who aren't playing, and then for you as the player. So overall, yes, this is a pretty poor audio experience because the sound is traveling away from you, which makes it feel muffled. Now, because we don't have a 3.5mm headphone jack, you've got a couple different options. The first would be to use headphones that have a direct USB-C, or else use something like a USB-C dongle. And there's good and bad with these dongles. The bad is that you've got this extra adapter hanging off your device, which can be a little bit awkward. The good part is that depending on your USB dongle, it can actually greatly improve and enhance your overall experience, because these can be little amplifiers. Now, I don't want to go too deep into audio stuff, but I think it's important to cover in this video just because I think a lot of people are interested in using the RG Rotate as an MP3 player. So let's talk about these four options right here and my experience with them. We'll start with the Apple dongle right here. If you remember, they were the ones who were so brave that they removed the 3.5mm headphone jack from their phones, and so ever since then we've been having to use dongles like this. I think this one's around $9 or $10. It's pretty decent. It gives you a clean audio output, but I will say for the RG Rotate, it is very quiet. In fact, I had to go up to about 70-80% volume just to make it at a comfortable level. So I don't think this one is going to be good with the RG Rotate if you're going to be using it in public, just because this doesn't get very loud. Another cheap dongle that a lot of people like is this one right here, the JM6 Pro from JC Alley, and unfortunately this one does not work at all with the RG Rotate. Plugged it in, a couple different headphones, and none of them worked. So it might be that the RG Rotate just isn't giving enough juice for this particular dongle, but yes, it's not working. Another USB dongle I use a lot is this one from Ugreen. It's about $10, but I like the clean look of it, and this one works very well. It gives you a nice volume boost on the RG Rotate, and it's a pretty clean sound as well. So if you're looking for something for $10 that you can get on Amazon, this one is pretty great. Now, my favorite one with the RG Rotate is this one. It's called the Odyssey Retro, and it's by Venture Electronics. They make really cheap audio accessories and then some high-end stuff as well. This dongle you can order in combination with one of their cheap earbuds, which are called the Monk Plus, and this one is the 7th generation, and for $10 you can get both the adapter and a pair of headphones. And the Monk Plus headphones have been around for a while and are known in the audiophile world as being like the best very, very cheap headphones that you can find. After all, these are usually about $5 or $10 depending on the one that you get. And in full disclosure, the person that sent this over to me is the person who owns this company, and they are also my contact at Anbernic too. So they sent these over a while back and I've been testing them out, and I do think these give you the best audio quality overall. What I like about the Odyssey Retro is that it has a very warm and classic sound. They describe it as being a Panasonic sound, and I totally agree with that. It kind of feels like playing through something a bit more analog. And so that's what I like about this particular USB dongle, is that it sounds very classic and it's a really great fit when playing retro games. The Monk Plus headphones are also quite decent, especially considering that they are $5, and so I think it's just an added bonus where I think the dongle is easily worth the $10 and then the headphones just come for free with it. So when it comes down to it, easily the best audio experience you can have with this device is to use a USB dongle. I like the Odyssey Retro one, but even something as simple as the one from Ugreen is going to sound pretty good. Personally, I do not prefer to use a dongle when playing a device like this just because it adds additional weight to the back of it and it feels a little bit awkward. But in general, if you're looking for the best audio quality, then this setup is not half bad at all. Ideally, I would have preferred just a straight 3.5mm headphone jack, but I also appreciate the boost in audio quality that we get from a USB dongle like this one. Another way you could enjoy audio on this device is with Bluetooth headphones, but unfortunately, we only have Bluetooth 5.0 on this device, and it does cause a significant audio delay when using it. Here's a quick test between playing on the speakers themselves and Bluetooth audio so you can see the latency between the two. And so yes, there's a pretty big delay between the two. When you're playing a platformer like this one, as you jump with your character, instead of hearing it as you're jumping, you're going to hear the jump sound near the end of your jump, and it's a little bit jarring. So the way I see it, the speakers on the device are not great, the Bluetooth audio is delayed, and so that really just leaves me with a USB-C dongle. Okay, now let's talk about software. It's going to be pretty standard, just an Android 12 experience. It comes preloaded with a bunch of apps, including the Google Play Store, so you can add your own. They have added some special apps to this one, like this Casio player right here, but for me personally, I've just been using my own music app, which is called Plexamp. Within the Android settings, there's a handheld game console settings, and within that, there is a rotate setting. And from here, you can adjust what the device does when you open it and close it. When you open it, you can either have it wake up or also wake up and unlock the device. And when you close it, you can either have it do nothing, so the screen is just going to stay on. You can have it go to a lock screen, or you can have it go into sleep. For this model, I haven't adjusted anything. So when I close it, it's going to go into the lock screen. It's going to show you this little clock right here, and you can adjust these faceplates. To do that, just press and hold on the front page, go into wallpaper and style, and then at the bottom, there's one that says lock clock. They've got 4 different options here. I'm hoping that somebody will come up with additional ones that you can add because these are a little bit gaudy, but overall this is how you would change it. For my plastic one, which is the one that I set up the other day, this one I just have it set to open up and unlock. When I open it and then close it, it just goes to sleep. And so that's what I've been doing with this one. It is worth noting that the power button on this device sticks out just a tiny bit from the shell to the point where sometimes in my backpack, it's been touched and knocked accidentally and it'll power on. And so sometimes I'll pull this thing out of my bag and it's super hot. It got really toasty because at some point it got jostled and it hit that power button. And again, because of the small battery on this, I don't really plan on putting it in sleep that often, but that is one thing worth noting is that I had a couple times where it got hot and toasty because it had been tapped and then turned on. On the right side, we've got this button down below the power button. If we press and hold that, it's going to bring up the Anbernic front end. And so if you buy something like a preloaded card at the time of purchase, like the one they sent me here, it's going to come preloaded with a bunch of games and you could just launch them here directly. It's not going to have a very comprehensive list for a lot of these systems, but if you're looking for something a bit more plug and play, then that's going to work out pretty well. On the device that I personally set up, I went through and I deleted all of the Anbernic emulators and added my own, and then I added Emulation Station Desktop Edition as my front end. And then I set it up in the settings where I can just press and hold that. It's going to open that instead. And so that's the way that I've been using the device. I've set it up with Emulation Station, and I can just go through and navigate through all my various apps and then pick my game from here. And if you want to get back to Android, you can just press and hold the button again. It'll take you right back there. So I think that is pretty handy to have a dedicated button like that. Now, as far as just using this thing as a media player, you can absolutely do that. The touchscreen will still work if you have it closed, so you can always navigate through that. So you could use this to, watch YouTube or Netflix, or in this case, I've got Plexamp running, which is my home server that allows me to stream my own music. And so by adding my own media server, I've basically turned this thing into a glorified MP3 player. And you can do the same thing with movies and other media too. And I think that's one of the major draws of this device is that it kind of looks and feels like a fat, small phone. And so it's not going to have cell signal or anything else like that, but you could use it as a Wi-Fi media device. And unlike your standard MP3 player, this thing can game. So let's talk about some of the games that I tested on here. Not every single thing, but I want to give you an idea of what to expect. To start, we've got our squarish aspect ratio systems, things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. These are going to be an excellent fit because the original systems were similar to a square aspect ratio as well. And like I mentioned before, Game Boy Advance will be a perfect 3x integer scale on this device. It looks super sharp and crisp. You will get some black bars at the top and bottom, and it also will only be about 3 inches in size, but yes, it looks beautiful. There are definitely better ways to play Game Boy Advance. I think that the RG34XX SP with its 3.4-inch display is going to look a little bit bigger, but in general, I still think this is an excellent GBA device. The handheld itself is also small enough to be able to play a lot of games one-handed if you'd like as well, mostly for role-playing games, things where you don't have to do fast action controls, but in general, yeah, that'll work too. Another handheld system that looks really good on this device is the Neo Geo Pocket Color, again because it has a squarish aspect ratio, so this is going to fill up the display nicely. There are not a ton of games for this particular console, but if you want to dive into it, this will be an excellent way to try it out. For me, my favorite systems to play on this device are Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and TurboGrafx-16, and that's because of that trick that I mentioned earlier, where you can set this to an 8:7 aspect ratio, turn on integer scaling as well as overscale, and that's going to almost fill the entire display, but at an integer scale with those systems. It takes a little bit of time to adjust to the 8:7 aspect ratio. It doesn't look the same as 4:3, it's a little bit taller, but after a while my eyes just adjust to it and it looks wonderful. In all my testing, I'm using a ZFast CRT shader just to add a little bit of softness and depth to the overall picture, but not much, and it's not taxing on the system either. And the great thing about this CPU is that it can handle all these games no problem, then also a lightweight CRT shader, and then you can also turn on run ahead, so I have that on here to also reduce input latency. And so not only are these games perfectly scaled with a CRT effect on top of them, but they also are playing nice and zippy too, so it's a wonderful way to play some of your favorite retro systems. Now when it comes to Sega Genesis, this is one I prefer to use in 4:3. 8:7 just looks really tall and wonky for this one, and so I keep this at 4:3, but you can still see that it looks pretty nice. It's about 3.1 inches altogether, and I still think this is perfectly playable. Everything is still going to look a little bit small on this device because of the smaller display, so it really comes down to the balance between portability and pocketability, and then something that's easily visible. And I would say that this device definitely errs on the side of being portable and pocketable. Moving up to 3D systems like PS1 and beyond, this is where things get interesting. We've got enough juice to be able to upscale these games up to like 1080p, but the resolution on the screen is only 720 by 720. And because the width is also only 720 pixels, you can't do a lot of upscaling that's actually going to be visible on this display. At most, you would want to do maybe a 1.5 resolution scale. And so for most of these systems, I just push them to a 2x resolution scale, which is still more pixels than you'll see on the screen, but at least it's going to run at full speed, no problem. When we get into Nintendo 64, this one can be a little bit wonky because it really depends on the game that you're playing and whether or not it's going to translate well to using a D-pad. I think that for racing games like Mario Kart and F-Zero, using a D-pad is not half bad at all, and so this is something that I wouldn't mind doing. But when it comes to something like Mario 64, it's just going to be a digital input, and so we're not going to have all the nuance of controls like you do with an analog stick, so I would not want to play Mario 64 on this particular device just because it feels a little bit limited. As far as power, you should be able to play every Nintendo 64 game you can think of, even the heavier hitting games like Cruisin' USA. It's going to be similar with Dreamcast. I'm using the Redream emulator here with a 2x scale, and everything is playing great. The main limitation, again, is going to be the controls and having to convert them over to a D-pad. And again, I think it works pretty well with racing games and fighting games and stuff, but you may be limited to more 3D platformers. It's not going to feel good with a D-pad. But otherwise, yes, Dreamcast is going to be fully playable. When it comes to Sega Saturn, I think that the only emulator that's really worth using on this particular chipset is the Yabasanshiro 2 standalone emulator. This one uses frame skip to give you a smooth gameplay experience, but it's not going to be a full, legit 60 frames per second with many of these games. Personally, I don't really mind that. It still feels nice and smooth. So if you are looking to play Sega Saturn games, maybe not in the most perfect way possible, I would say that the majority of the catalog is going to be playable here. Even harder to play games like Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally Championship did really well with the standalone emulator. Moving on to PSP, this is one I didn't really enjoy. The performance is great. You can play it at a 2x scale, everything is going to play fine, but the problem is that it's super small. It's 2.8 inches because it's a 16:9 aspect ratio. And for me personally, this is just too small to really enjoy. But if you are looking for the thrill of playing PSP on a very small device, this is going to be able to play the full catalog. You can also play a little bit of GameCube and PS2, but I didn't do that in my testing here with this impressions video. I will leave that for the final review, but I would say on average you can probably play maybe 25% of the catalog if you're willing to go in and fiddle with the settings. Personally, I think the combination of the controls and the fact that this thing is just so small is not a very good fit for those particular systems, but you can squeeze it out if you want. The last system I wanted to mention is Pico 8. This is actually a square aspect ratio system, and there's a new Android app that actually allows you to play it natively. So what you do is once you download this app, you have to use your purchased game files. It'll have you navigate to them. It'll use the Raspberry Pi files. But after that, it opens up Explore. You're able to download and play your games directly on this device. And there are thousands of games to choose from. The only thing I would recommend doing is pressing the left shoulder button to bring up the menu. And then under integer scaling, I like to turn this off because that's going to fill up the entire display. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit small. And so from there, you can just navigate through the system, go into the featured section, or you can actually search by game, and then you can pull up each of these games and then try them out and then favorite them if you would like. And you can see here I've got a bunch of favorites that I've added, and so these are games that you can play directly on here. They work great. One of my favorite relaxing games on Pico 8 is Marble Merger. This is just like a Suica kind of game where you just drop a bunch of balls down and then they get bigger as they connect with one that's a similar size. And so this is one of my favorite ways to relax, is to play this game, and it works perfectly fine here. So I love the fact that I can play Pico 8 with Explore on an Android device, and this is a perfect fit. It might be one of the best ways that you can play Pico 8 right now. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground already, so I'm going to stop it here and let's start to summarize what I like and what I don't like about the device so far. And there's a lot to like. Number one is the form factor. I love that we have a new shape and size, and the rotating screen is just a nice little fidget as well. I also love the idea of keeping it closed and using it as an MP3 player. All of that is possible. The design is well balanced. I was worried it was going to be top heavy, but it actually feels great, both with the metal and plastic version. The screen is also excellent, but a little bit small, so keep that in mind. This is geared towards an everyday carry or portable scenario. I think the buttons are decent as well. They're relatively quiet and nice and clicky and easy to press down on. I also appreciate that it's easy to charge. Every charger and cable that I tried worked out fine, and it also charges quickly, usually in an hour or less. And when it comes to playing retro systems, the Unisoc T618 chipset is plenty powerful, so we're able to play everything up through PSP. Of course, there are some things that I don't like about it, and first and foremost is the audio experience. The speaker on the back projects the sound to everyone but you, and so it feels a little bit awkward and muffled, and Bluetooth headphones have a significant delay when actually playing games. They also didn't add a 3.5mm headphone jack, so you'll have to use a USB dongle, and that does sound really great, but it also means you have to live that dongle life. And compared to other devices, the battery life on this is not great. I've got an average about 5 hours with mixed gameplay, which is not terrible, but still I've seen a lot better on other handhelds. And even though they've got a clever workaround that allows you to use the D-pad as a left analog stick, the controls in general are going to be limited. So there will be some games, like for Nintendo 64, where you've got enough juice to be able to play the game, but you're not really going to want to because of the controls that we have on the device. Another thing I noticed is that it was very easy to accidentally press on the power button and wake the device from sleep, and when it's in my bag like that, it came out really hot, and so that's why I'm calling it a hot pocket here. I'm hoping that they will update the software to disable the power button when the screen is closed. Either way, it's just one thing to keep in mind. I would recommend, if you're going to be throwing this in your bag, is to actually power it off, because both times that I tried to put it in my bag and transport it around, it accidentally turned on and got really warm. As far as playing it, it does get a little bit warm on the heavier duty systems, but I didn't find it to be bad at all, and so I actually think that it's pretty good when it comes to cooling. So putting it all together, I actually really like the RG Rotate. It feels fresh and new. I love this overall design. It's a little bit of a smaller handheld, but they got everything right. The biggest oversight for me is that it doesn't have a 3.5mm headphone jack, because I would have loved to just use it as an MP3 player on its own. It's not the end of the world to use a USB dongle, but it is one additional step setup and piece of equipment. Even though this is an impressions video, I'm probably not going to be able to do my full review before this device releases, and so you might be wondering whether or not I recommend it. And as it stands, based on just how I've been using it over the past couple days, yeah, I think it's pretty great. Personally, I prefer the plastic model just because I like my devices to feel a bit more retro, but if you're looking for something premium, I think the metal one is going to be satisfying in that way too. I've got a couple more things I want to test, like some more in-depth battery testing and a little bit of long-term usage with the plastic versus the metal version, and how the screen holds up by being in my pocket. I'll probably also do a little bit of high-end emulation testing as well, so be on the lookout for a final review in the coming week or so, but as it stands right now, I'm pretty impressed by this guy. Whether or not it's worth picking up is really going to depend on you and whether or not you already have a similar handheld, or if you're looking for something to use outside of just gaming, like a media player, because this is a pretty good fit for that too. At the end of the day, there's a lot more positives than negatives for this handheld, and so yeah, I think that the RG Rotate is pretty neat. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.